Hello everyone, my name is Gajendra Das Sharma and you are watching English, and in this video we are going to explain some of the important questions on William Wordsworth and his works. These questions have been already asked in various examinations of TGT and PGT. Besides, you will get to know some of the important points related to these questions and their comprehensive explanation. So let us start this video. The first question is, lyrical ballads were better known or better appreciated in America than in England. The first edition published in America in the year 1798, 1801, 1805 or 1802. And the correct answer is it was the year 1802 when the second edition of the lyrical ballads was published in America. And as such there it was better appreciated. It was published in Philadelphia. The first edition came in the year 1798. It was first edition and it came with a short advertisement. The second edition was published in the year 1802. It was second edition and it is better known as 1800 edition. So this thing has to be kept in mind very carefully. The second edition was published in 1802 and it was known as, it was the title that was given to it, 1800 edition. And this was the enlarged edition, and this was the third edition that was published in the year 1802, and this was published in America, Philadelphia. Lyrical ballads has a subtitle as well, which is with a few other poems. So lyrical ballads with a few other poems, it is the complete title of that collection anthology, Lyrical Ballads, and this is regarded as the true beginning of the Romantic movement, or it is also said to be the prelude to the Romantic movement. Lyrical Ballad was planned in the year 1797. So this was the year when it was planned, and it was published for the first time in the year 1798. And this is the true beginning of that Romantic movement. That's why this year is very much important. This was the collection of the poems of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Coleridge had 4 poems published in this anthology and Wordsworth 19. The second edition had the preface, the famous preface. This famous preface where he gave the theory of poetic diction, and he also developed the view or his view of the nature of poetic process. So he gave his views on poetic diction, and second thing, he developed his view of the nature of the poetic process, origin, and the purpose of poetry, and at the same time, the language most suitable for it. So, in this second edition that was published in 1801, that is known as 1800 edition. So, he gave his famous preface where he gave his poetic diction, theory of poetic diction, and here in this preface, he developed his views of the nature of poetic process, the origin and the purpose of poetry, and the language most suitable for it. So the preface was a kind of defense for his upcoming volume. He was very much aware that he was going to publish some new kind of poetry. People may not be very prepared for this kind of poetry, so better he wanted to make them aware his poetic theory, poetic process, and his views of poet, views on the nature of poetry, the purpose of poetry, and the kind of language that was most suitable for this kind of prosody or composition. So all these things he developed in this preface of the second edition. This is the complete list of the anthology, the lyrical ballads. The Rime of Ancient Mariner, you have to mark the spelling as well. This is the exact spelling and it can be asked in the examination. So the original spelling that was given in this anthology was Ancient Mariner, Ancient Mariner. The other poem was The Foster Mother's Tale, The Nightingale, and The Dungeon. These 4 poems were composed by Coleridge and rest of them they were composed by Wordsworth. The first is The Rime of Ancient Mariner and the last is Tintern Abbey. First by Coleridge and last by Wordsworth. The similar title like lyrical tales, like lyrical ballads. One other anthology was also published entitled The Lyrical Tales. Lyrical Tales was the collection of narrative poems and they were composed by Mary Robinson. This collection was published in 1800 and it was influenced by lyrical ballads. One of the tale entitled The Haunted Beach was based on the rhyme of Ancient Mariner. So this poem, The Haunted Beach, was particularly based on or exactly based on the rhyme of Ancient Mariner. So sometimes there can be the questions like this. Lyrical ballads, as we all know that it was composed by Wordsworth and Coleridge, but who composed Lyrical Tales? So Lyrical Tales was also published in the same year, 1800, and it was the anthology of narrative poems, and anthology was by Mary Robinson. She was the only female poet of that time. Next question: who said there is no essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition? The correct answer is undoubtedly William Wordsworth, and then he said this statement in the preface to the lyrical ballads and the preface to the second edition, as we discussed in the previous question. So here in this preface, he developed his views of the nature of the poetic process, origin and the purpose of poetry, and the language that was most suitable for that. In this edition, he declared that materials of poetry can be found in every subject which can interest the human mind. He also explained that these poems were experiment written chiefly to entertain how far the language of conversation in the middle and lower classes of society is adapted to the purpose of poetic pleasure. He himself asserted that the principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. And further and above all, to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them, truly though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of our nature, chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas of the state of excitement. So, in the very preface, he has made it very clear that he is going to choose the incidents and situations from rural, common, rustic life because he believes that the heart can easily relate to these commonplace situations and commonplace feelings. And then the humanity lies here in this mother nature or lap of mother nature, and it is there in the rural setting only. And as such, the settings and the situations are chosen from common life, so will be the language as well. And this will not be the language of metrical composition or rather sophisticated or highly poetic language. Rather, it will be the language of prose. And for that purpose, he discards the gaudiness and inane phraseology of modern writers. He insists that his poems contain little poetic diction and they are written in selection of real language of man in a state of vivid sensation. And here in this statement, he sums up his theory of poetic diction that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and that of metrical composition. So, likewise, he presents his views about the language that should be suitable for this kind of composition. He believes that he is talking about the commonplace thing, and as such they should be communicated in a commonplace language. They should not be very stylized or very stylish and sophisticated language. It should be commonplace language. It should be the language of a common man. Next question: name the poem from which the following words have been quoted. The gods approve the depth and not the tumult of the soul. Which was the poem? The world is too much with us, the tables turn, ode to duty, or Laodamia. The correct answer is it was the poem Laodamia where these lines occur. Laodamia was published in 1815 and second edition came in 1845. They were published in the collection Poems. And this was the poem based on, it was a narrative poem based on Trojan War, the story of Trojan War. The story deals with the classical story of the hero of Trojan War, Protesilaus. Protesilaus, he sacrificed himself. Actually, what happened? The Delphic oracle prophesied that whichever side has first sacrifice will lead to its victory. That is to say, out of these two sides, Trojan and the Greeks, whichever side has first sacrifice will win this battle. So, in order to prove this oracle correct or true, the hero Protesilaus, he sacrificed himself. He was killed by Hector, so that his side, the Greeks, would become victorious. So he was the very first person to have sacrificed his life for the Greeks in Trojan War, in accordance with the prophecy of the Delphic oracle. And Laodamia was the wife of this legendary hero Protesilaus. When he sacrificed himself, when he was no more, Laodamia wept so much, and then she cried so much, she lamented so much that she invoked the Hades, the god of underworld, and wanted to revoke the life of her husband. Laodamia appealed Hades, the god of underworld, to return the life of her husband, Protesilaus. This was a similar condition with Savitri and Satyavan Katha, where Savitri wanted Yamraj to return the life of her husband, Satyavan. In the same situation, Laodamia appealed before Hades so much in order to get the life of her husband returned. But unlike Satyavan and Savitri Katha, Hades did not return, and as such, with the grief, Laodamia herself committed suicide because she felt that her life did not mean anything without the life of her husband. Her life had no charm, no novelty, no meaning in the absence of her husband, and as such, she committed suicide. So Protesilaus sacrificed his life for the honor of his country, for the victory of his own country, and his wife sacrificed for his honor or for him. So this story has been dealt with by Wordsworth in this poem Laodamia. Next question. Wordsworth learned that verse may build a princely throne on a humble truth. From Robert Burton, Robert Bridges, Robert Burns, or Robert Blair. And the correct answer is it was Robert Burns who inspired Wordsworth and then who had a deep impact on Wordsworth. The line occurred in the elegy by Wordsworth for Robert Burns, At the Graves of Burn. This was composed by William Wordsworth. So this was a kind of elegy on the death of Robert Burns. And here this line occurred. This poem was composed in 1803, and it was 7 years after the death of Robert Burns. In this elegy, Wordsworth addresses him as the spirit fierce and bold. As spirit fierce and bold. These kind of questions are generally asked. Who has been addressed by Wordsworth as spirit fierce and bold? And the options can be given like Dorothy Wordsworth, Coleridge, Robert Southey. These three people had been associated with Wordsworth quite closely. And the fourth option can be Robert Burns. But this was so unfamiliar, so we may go for Coleridge or Dorothy Wordsworth, and in this way we can spoil our question. The correct answer will be Robert Burns. Wordsworth himself once wrote that he had been indebted to the North for more than he should ever be able to acknowledge. He means to include the border ballads and certainly the poetry of Robert Burns here in this statement. He further assumes that Burns was one whose light he hailed when first it shone, and from whom he learned in youth how verse may build a princely throne on humble truth. So Wordsworth was admirer of Robert Burns. This thing has to be kept in mind very carefully. An admirer of Burns, Robert Burns. Next question. Which work of Wordsworth has been called the fine flower of 18th century medieval poetry? Was it Lyrical Ballads, Immortality Ode, The Recluse, or the Tintern Abbey? And the correct answer is it was Tintern Abbey, and it was Professor Elton, and then he said about Tintern Abbey, from one point of view, is the flower of 18th century medieval poetry. Next question. The prelude by Wordsworth was part of a vast work which was to be called The Excursion, Yarrow Revisited, The Recluse, and the Peter Bell. The correct answer is it was planned to be the part of Recluse. So Prelude was composed in or completed in 1805 and it was published in 1850, and it was intended to be the part of or rather introduction of the enterprise the Recluse. So Recluse was never completed. It was projected a three-part poem on man, on nature and on human life or human society. It was planned in 1798. So Prelude was planned to be its introduction. Only the second part of this enterprise, the Recluse, came into existence in the form of the Excursion. Third part was only planned. First part, the manuscript was left by William Wordsworth himself and it was known to be Home at Grasmere. So Prelude was published separately as an individual poem. But initially it was planned to be the introduction or the part of this Recluse. Excursion was also the part of Recluse. Next question, which out of the following is not a poem by Wordsworth? London 1802, Strange Fits of Passion Have I Known, The Solitary Reaper and London. And the correct answer is it was London. That was not composed by William Wordsworth. London was composed by William Blake. The other poem by the name of London was composed by Dr. Johnson. So William Blake composed London, and then a poem of the same title was also composed by Dr. Johnson. William Wordsworth composed London 1802 and it was the poem on Milton. So London 1802 was based on Milton, or he invoked Milton in this poem. It was composed in 1802 and published in 1807 in the famous collection Poems in 2 volumes. So the title it is 1802, but it was published in 1807. In 1802 it was merely composed, and this is a Petrarchan sonnet even. Petrarchan sonnet. The rhyming scheme of this poem is ABBA, ABBA, CDD, ECE. This is the rhyming scheme of, this is octave and this is sestet. So it is in second person addressed to Milton. He pays homage to Milton in this sonnet for his noble virtue and his nobility and his character. And then second purpose of this poem is to draw attention to what he feels that the society of London, society of England lacked. He feels that society of London or England lacked certain qualities which were found only in Milton. So he invokes Milton to come again in this present century so that people can learn manners and etiquettes and virtues, and here in this sense he can reform the present century. The present century could be reformed only with the presence of such figures as Milton, because Milton could possess the high virtues which were needed for this corrupt or problematic society or problematic century. Next question, the verse lines, she gave me eyes, she gave me ears, and humble cares and dedicate fears were in the reference to River Wye, Annette Wellen, Dorothy Wordsworth, or ancestral Scotland. The correct answer is it was Dorothy Wordsworth who is referred to in these words, and it was in the poem The Sparrow's Nest. The poem entitled The Sparrow's Nest. It was a lyrical poem that came in 1801 and it was composed in 1801 and published in 1807 in the famous collection Poems in 2 volumes. This poem is a tribute to Dorothy Wordsworth. He recalls here in this poem their childhood experiences, the childhood memories they spent together in Cockermouth. Dorothy is also referred to or addressed as Emmeline in this poem. So it can also be asked in the examination, who has been addressed by Wordsworth in one of his poems as Emmeline. So Emmeline is none other than Dorothy Wordsworth, and she was addressed as Emmeline in The Sparrow's Nest. This poem was kept in the section of this collection, Moods of My Mind. Certain section of this anthology, Poems in 2 volumes, was entitled Moods of My Mind, and in this section this poem was kept. The other poem of this section is To a Butterfly or The Daffodils. So To the Butterfly, The Daffodils and The Sparrow's Nest, they were kept in this section Moods of My Mind, and this section belonged to this collection of 1807 poems in 2 volumes. And here in this poem, he addresses her like she gave me eyes, she gave me ears, and humble cares and delicate fears. Next question. The English Romantic poets were influenced by Oxford movement, Darwinism, peasants movement, and French Revolution. The correct answer is it was French Revolution that attracted the attention of romantic poets like William Wordsworth, S.T. Coleridge, P.B. Shelley, and Lord Byron. The political interests and activities in French Revolution, they attracted the attention of these poets and then they hailed this revolution. So these poets like Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Coleridge, they were attracted by the principles of French Revolution. The three-word motto of French Revolution influenced them dearly, where it said liberty, fraternity, and equality. So they also wanted to imbibe this three-word formula in English literary world. It was not in political world, but it was there in literary world. They wanted to set free English literature from the shackles of a century long neoclassical age or the conventions, poetic conventions of neoclassical age. They wanted to express freely, not under the guise or under the dominance of some literary dictator like Dr. Johnson or some other poets. So they wanted to make full use of their imagination. They wanted to use multiple kinds of themes in their poetry. So the political beliefs and political interests and activities of French Revolution influenced these poets, and these ideologies were reflected in these poems as well, the poems of these writers. Next question. Which of the following statements is not correct about William Wordsworth? Wordsworth records that his earliest verses were the tame imitations of poets' versification. Throughout his life, he never wavered in his faith in himself and his immortality as a poet. Lyrical ballads were published at Cockermouth. The prelude was completed in 1805. And the correct answer is option C. Lyrical ballads was published at Cockermouth. It is the wrong option. He was born at Cockermouth and he published lyrical ballads at Bristol rather than at Cockermouth. Bristol in 1798. So this thing has to be kept in mind very carefully. Wordsworth has himself accepted that his early poems were the imitations of Pope's versification. He was influenced by Alexander Pope and his versification. Even sometimes Wordsworth has used or copied the same kind of phrases. He himself says that it may be perhaps as well to mention that the first verses which I wrote were a task imposed by my master, the subject, the summer vacation, and of my own accord I added others upon return to school. There was nothing remarkable in either poem, but I was called upon, among other scholars, to write verses upon completion of the second centenary from the foundation of the school in 1585 by Archbishop Sandys. These verses were much admired, far more than they deserved, for they were but a tame imitations of Pope's versification and a little in his style. This exercise, however, put it into my head to compose verses from the impulses of my own mind, and I wrote, while yet a schoolboy, a long poem running upon my own adventures and the scenery of the country in which I was brought up. The only part of that poem which has been preserved in the conclusion of it, which states at the beginning of my collected poems, Dear Native Reason. So here in this memoir, he accepts that his early poems were the tame imitations of Pope's versification. Throughout his life, he never wavered in his faith in himself and his immortality as a poet. This is very true to his nature as well. Whatever task he gave himself, he stuck to it throughout his life. He wanted to make this natural world, outside natural world, look unfamiliar, to show its multifarious manifestations, to show its hidden realities, and to make the people empathize with nature, to make the people realize how they could associate themselves with nature. So his faith in the nature, in the bounties of nature, in his own nature, and his association with nature, and his task as a poet, He never wavered, he never digressed in his mission, which he kept throughout his life. And this is, in fact, reflected in every of his poems. The prelude, as we have discussed in earlier questions, it was completed in 1805 and it was published in 1850. So completion date is different and the publication date is quite different. So that is all for now. Hopefully this video has added something to your present knowledge of William Wordsworth and his works. The questions I have dealt with and their comprehensive explanation along with the important facts will certainly help you in your preparation for upcoming examinations of TGT and PGT and other various examinations like UPGIC as well. So keep watching, like this video, share it among your friends, and do subscribe to the channel if you have not subscribed to it so far. Thanks for watching.